This podcast has been sponsored by Activia. Maintaining a healthy gut is key for overall physical and mental well-being. Whether you're a health-conscious advocate, an individual navigating the complexities of living with GI issues, or a healthcare provider, you are in the right place. The Gut Health Podcast will empower you with a fascinating scientific connection between your brain, food, and the gut. Come join us. We welcome you.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Gut Health Podcast, where we talk about all things related to your gut and well-being. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Megan Reel, a GI health psychologist.
And I'm Kate Scarletta, a GI expert dietitian. And today we're diving into the world of biotics. Probiotics, prebiotics, and postbiotics. You've probably seen these terms on yogurt labels and supplements, or even health blogs, but do you really know what they mean? Are they different? Do you need all of them? Most importantly, how do they actually affect your digestion, your immune system, and your overall well-being? We'll unpack the science, bust a few myths, and give you some easy takeaways that can support your gut health for every day.
So our guest today is going to help us with many of these answers. Dr. Mary Ellen Sanders, welcome. She is a consultant in the area of probiotic microbiology. She works internationally with food and supplement companies to develop new probiotic products and offers perspective on paths to scientific substantiation of probiotic product label claims. She was the founding president and executive science officer for the International Scientific Association of Probiotics and Prebiotics, the ISAPP. You can check out very valuable information at www.isappscience.org. This is an organization devoted to advancing the science of probiotics, prebiotics, symbiotics, postbiotics, and fermented foods. Through ISAPP, she participated in many scientific efforts, as reflected in her over 140 peer publications, and led many communication efforts in the biotics space. Dr. Sanders lives in Colorado with her husband, where she enjoys time with her two grandchildren, hiking, and riding her 26-year-old Morgan horse. Welcome, Dr. Sanders.
Oh, thank you so much, Megan.
Love that you have a horse. I actually love horseback riding. I don't do it that often. I don't own one, but any chance I get to ride one, I find it just the most peaceful, relaxing activity. So I love that.
It's been a great hobby, and I've really enjoyed sharing it with my grandkids and my daughter, of course, while she was growing up. Yeah.
That's awesome. So we're going to get right into the definition of probiotics. What is it?
So probiotics are live microorganisms that, when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit on the host. And this is a very broad definition. And it's important to realize that probiotics, even though we know them mostly in foods and dietary supplements, the definition is broad enough that it really encompasses not just food for people. So there are probiotic products that are made for agricultural animals, and even some, for example, for my horse. You can buy probiotics for your horse. You can buy them for your pets. They're not just foods. You mentioned dietary supplements already, but they could also be potentially formulated into drugs, into medical products. And they're not just orally consumed. So in addition to not being just foods, they could, for example, be applied as a probiotic on your skin. There's also some preparations that are intravaginal. So there are different ways that probiotics can be administered. And so I just point that out because it is a very broad, all-encompassing definition. And one other point I think that we don't want to leave behind in this introduction to probiotics is how important it is that the microorganisms that are in that comprise a probiotic are defined to the strain level. And what that means is that you have a genus of a microorganism, a species, and then there's always a strain designation, because even within the same species, you can have genetic variation that will identify different strains among the same species. So one popular probiotic is Lactocacei bacillus rhamnosus GG. So the Lactocacei bacillus, which incidentally used to be lactobacillus, but the nomenclature changed. So Lactocacei bacillus is the genus, rhamnosus is the species, and GG is the strain designation. And then one last really important point about that definition is that these microorganisms need to be well defined to the strain level, but they also have to be tested for a health benefit to be able to legitimately be called a probiotic.
Yeah, I think it's also confusing. Sometimes people don't realize they're alive. They have to be alive. You know what I mean? In your body, they are alive. So when we're talking about like even fermented foods, and I know we've had an episode on that. If something's baked, it's not going to be a source of a probiotic because that microorganism has been killed. So when consumers are looking for a probiotic, what should they be looking for when they're selecting one?
And that's a great question. And it's quite difficult, I think, for consumers to weed through everything that's on the market that has the word probiotic on a label. Just some tips for doing that. If you're looking for a probiotic in a food product, I think one helpful thing to do is to make sure that the product lists the strain designation on the label. And I was involved in a survey project with a colleague of mine, and we looked at the different products in the refrigerated section of the grocery store and looked at what kind of information was given on the labels. And what we found was that the products that contain the strain designations were more likely to be able to be linked then to health benefits. So I think it's a good idea to just make sure that the company is putting the strain designation. That also says that they're being sophisticated about their approach to the field. They recognize that not all probiotics are the same. So that's just one hint I would throw out there. And I think if you're looking at supplements, and it's not quite as common in food products, unfortunately, but make sure if you're looking for a dietary supplement that it does show the dose that's in the product. And very importantly, the product should not say at time of manufacture. So the dose should not be at time of manufacture. It should be indicated to be through the end of shelf life. And so if the use by date on the product is there, you should be able to get the indicated dose all the way through that use by time. And so it's important to make sure that your product does not say at time of manufacture.
Absolutely.
It's so funny that, and I want to hear more of these tips and tricks because, now that we're doing this podcast and we've had really the benefit of having some amazing world-renowned experts, but I'm now getting more and more of my friends and family that they're like, hey, it makes sense that a probiotic is at the pharmacy. But exactly to your point earlier, I've had a friend reach out and she's like, I was at my OBGYN. She's offering probiotics. Does my vagina really need a probiotic? And it's like it feels like there is something for everything these days. So to hear you bringing up all the products that are available, these tips and tricks are so helpful.
Good. One other tip I will give your listeners is that because, again, it is so difficult to wade through, the type of evidence that's available for a specific strain that's listed on a label, there is a guide out there, and it can be found at www.usprobioticguide.com. And this is a guide that is updated yearly, and it lists products available in the United States. And what it does that's different from pretty much any other resource you have out there is it specifies products and it tells you what strains are there, what the dose is, and what the tested evidence is for. And so it's really worth looking at. And if you can find products on that list, at least you know that a group of independent reviewers said that there was evidence to show that this product was tested for that benefit. But what I would caution you about that guide is that it includes 3 levels of benefit. It has level 1 evidence, level 2 evidence, and level 3 evidence. And I would pretty much ignore the level 2 and 3 evidence and just go with products that have level 1 evidence because it starts getting the level of evidence once they get to the level 3 is not that strong.
Okay.
I think that's really important. And that's what I tell my patients. If they're coming in with constipation, I'm going to try to find evidence for a probiotic strain that helps with constipation, right? So it's not necessarily like lactobacillus, what is it, KCI, whatever the new nomenclature.
The new name is lactocasei bacillus. I know it's such a mouthful.
Jeez,
I know.
it is a mouthful. My goodness. So, but you do want to select the right one for the right indication. And I think that's why a health professional can be a good guide and, certainly online guidance as well. But think about why you're taking it and then see if there's an indication for a specific probiotic strain for that indication.
And I do think another important point is that people will be their own determiners of a success. And, what we sometimes fail to communicate well, I think, is that, we do these research studies, they are all composed, or at the end of the study, what you have is aggregate data. And within that aggregate of data, there are always responders and non-responders that then get averaged out into the whole thing. And we are at a point in the field where we don't understand what really drives response and non-response to certain probiotics. And that's certainly true in the medical field with drugs as well. And so I think people can be their own titrators of, is this working for me or not?
I love that advice. I mean, we think our gut microbiome is personal to us. So why wouldn't our response be a little bit different, right? We're all different genes, different microbiome. I love that advice.
So if we've been on something for 3 years and you still are constipated, probably not the right probiotic for you.
Exactly. And in fact, I will say, without any evidence for saying this, I will usually tell people who just ask me, at a party, what should I do? And I'll say, try it for a month, and if you see no benefit, then try something else. Maybe probiotics aren't going to be a solution, or maybe you've got the wrong strain.
That's perfect. This kind of leads into our next question here. Should we all be using probiotics? Are there adverse effects to using them? Let's start with that.
Yeah. Well, the adverse effects is an excellent question. And I think sometimes in the food and dietary supplement world, we forget to ask that question. And we need to realize that products that are on the market as foods and dietary supplements are designed, it's a legal category of product to sell in the US, and they're designed for the general population that's generally healthy. And so if you have underlying health concerns, you have to recognize that these products have not necessarily been tested and shown to be safe in whatever condition you happen to have. Now, having said that, there's been many clinical conditions that have been tested for probiotics, but nothing is ever 100% safe. We have to recognize that. But I will say with the standard probiotics, the lactobacillus umbrella probiotics, the bifidobacteria, the Saccharomyces, and some other genera that have been used for a long time, we see really good tolerance for those, and there are very few side effects associated with them. But again, if you're severely immunocompromised, or if you have, some other underlying conditions, you for sure check with a medical professional before engaging in them.
Okay. Let's say I'm in my 40s. I eat a pretty wide range of fruits and vegetables. My bowel habits are typically pretty normal. I have the stressors of being a working mom. Do I need a probiotic?
There's very little evidence to say that, yes, you do. That's just not really how the studies have been done. I think I was involved in another project not too long ago. We really looked at the literature in certain areas for certain clinical indications for probiotics. And we asked the question, is there convincing evidence that healthy people should take a probiotic? And the end of our assessment, now keep in mind, we used a very high level of evidence. In other words, we were approaching this as if we were the United States, the US Preventive Services Task Force, who makes recommendations on, recommendations for healthy people. And they say what you can recommend and what you can't. They have a very high level of evidence that they require. And so we had someone formerly from that team on this discussion group. And we pretty much said, no, the evidence isn't there yet to really substantiate that you're going to necessarily benefit if you have no underlying concern that you're trying to address. I do think that there's emerging evidence to suggest that adding live microbes to your diet may provide some benefit, and those could come from fermented foods, those could come from probiotic foods or supplements. But I think the way to look at probiotics is to really focus on where the evidence shows that they seem to be beneficial. And I think probably top of the list is to support gut function during antibiotic use. It helps to decrease symptoms associated with antibiotic use. There is some good evidence, not excellent evidence, but good evidence to show that it can reduce the risk of respiratory tract infections. And again, I'm saying this very generally. Obviously, there are certain strains that have been tested for these conditions. Another one that I think is very interesting with your potential stressed mom is that there's really good evidence. I would say this is very high level evidence that one specific strain of Lactobacillus reuteri can reduce crying time in colicky breastfed babies. And that's a great one, actually. Then we also, to allude to the further point, a previous point that was made, is that there's reasonable evidence that you can reduce vaginal and urinary tract infections in women with using probiotics. And there are some digestive complaints like constipation, bloating, those types of things that I think it can do. And so, those are the areas that I think I would focus on. But again, if you have some reason that you have a concern, then you should be able to find out if it's working for you or not. Right, if you take a probiotic. So there's very little harm in taking a probiotic and seeing if if you have any measurable benefit from it.
Well, I would have loved that probiotic about 8 years ago with my firstborn.
You had a
God love
colicky
him.
baby. Yeah.
So did I.
Yeah, I think it reduced crying time by about an hour. I can't remember, an hour per day or something like that. And I'm
Wow.
thinking that's such a wonderful endpoint to study because people don't care how many lactobacillus reuteri you have in your gut, or they don't care about any of that. Like, my baby's not crying as much. That's an awesome endpoint.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yes. I know my mental health probably would have been better at that point if I had less crying and more sleep. So let's turn to your thoughts on this term psychobiotics. What does the science tell us about these?
Well, first of all, personally, I'm not a fan of the term.
Okay.
I say that only because there's just so many terms that people throw out there, and I think it causes more harm than good. I think people get very confused about what do all of these, you see immunobiotics, you see psychobiotics, you see pharmabiotics. There's all these different terms and they aren't robustly defined. And, I would much rather have someone say, we have a probiotic that has been studied for mental health issues or brain function or whatever. And that's my own personal bias. I do think that this is a really interesting, evolving area. We're not there yet to be able to strongly say that these specific strains are going to show big benefits for anxiety or mild depression or issues like that. But there are a few studies that have been conducted that show signals, that show that there might be something there. Great animal research, great preclinical research is behind a lot of this, but I think the translation of that research into humans has been tough to do. And I think we lack high quality, properly powered human trials to really get at this. And I will say, those trials are expensive to do. And until we better understand mechanisms and things like that, it's really hard to know who's going to benefit, who's not, as we mentioned earlier. So it's hard to know who to recruit into your study in order to give yourself a chance of really seeing a better signal. But I think it's a very exciting area. And again, I know there are some products on the market already with those endpoints. You can give them a try. And if they work for you, great.
Yeah, we're just not there.
We're not there yet. And so often there's still a lot of stigma around taking medication, pharmaceutical medication for mental health. And we see this similarly in gastroenterology patients, right? So, I think that they oftentimes would rather try a prebiotic than a pharmaceutical. And so this, again, may open some doors for people in the mental health space for additional options. But our takeaway today is the science just isn't there to yet totally replace your SSRI or your neuromodulator.
Well, and I think the other point that you alluded to, but didn't say overtly, was the medications that do exist can be laden with serious side effects.
That's right.
These are not medications that are just take it and you never, you see a benefit or nothing at all. They might be that you see a benefit, but you also see some real downsides to them. And that's where I think probiotics really have, there's a door open there because we don't seem to see the adverse effects associated with taking them. And it's because they're acting mechanistically in different ways than these other drugs are. And so I think there's real potential there. And I hope that continues. I know there's so many good scientists interested in this area. We'll make some progress.
Yeah, definitely. It is very interesting. And again, when you think back, the gut and brain and microbes creating neurotransmitters and how does that all make out in this probiotic, psychobiotics, or whatever we want to call them.
Yeah.
We're going to call them probiotics for gut-brain health. That's what we're going to call it.
Either that or just make sure you define what you mean by your term.
I hear you. I think it is very confusing for the consumer to hear all these different terms and what the heck they mean. So I think keep to probiotic, but then qualify what it's for. So we're going to switch to prebiotics. So I'd like to hear the definition of prebiotics and then where are we finding these prebiotics?
Well, I'll start with the scientific definition of prebiotics and then I will go from there. A prebiotic has been defined as a substrate that is selectively utilized by host microorganisms conferring a health benefit. And that's a big mouthful. But in short, what that really means is that prebiotics typically serve as food for the beneficial microorganisms that reside in your body. Okay. And like probiotics, they also have to be tested and shown to have a health benefit. So just because we have a soluble fiber that you can show that might have some impact on gut microbes, we won't call that a prebiotic until someone does a study and shows some endpoint that's been improved by consuming it. If that makes sense. Yeah.
It totally does. I love that this conferring, that's the big word,
It is.
conferring.
I know.
It's confers.
I was on the panels that came up with these definitions, and it's a lot harder to do than you might think because every single word has a meaning and you have to make sure it's not going to be misunderstood or somehow have a separate meaning that you didn't intend or something.
Exactly. But it does kind of crack me up. So when we think about prebiotics, I know this definition's changed a little bit over the years because I've been in this science for a while and, kind of was always about carbohydrates as being sort of a prebiotic. And now it's kind of slid into polyphenols and maybe some other food components too that can act this way. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Initially, they talked about them being carbohydrates and then usually fibers and typically soluble fibers. And so it's a very, very specific kind of a box, a chemical structure box that they were putting prebiotics in initially. The way the field has gone is that they started recognizing that maybe the value here is to look at what we're looking at in terms of mechanism of action, like what substances can be utilized by the microbes in your gut and then have some changes that are in your gut microbes, and then can that lead to a benefit? And what we found is it's more than just soluble fibers that can do that. And I am far from an expert on polyphenols, so I'm not going to say much at all about them. I know that they're very, very interesting compounds. They've got antioxidant properties. They have all these properties that are beyond just their ability to be utilized by the microbiota. I think that's a very exciting area that will be developed. But you're right. You don't have to be a carbohydrate anymore to fit into the prebiotic category.
Yeah, which is great because, we see these polyphenols in a lot of fruits and vegetables, extra virgin olive oil. So, some good things.
And I think that one of the things that we did keep in mind as we were developing definitions is that we really wanted them to be broad enough to encourage innovation. We didn't want to paint these substances into a box that wouldn't allow the clever scientists of the future to be able to think of something that we wouldn't have anticipated, right?
Yeah, that's excellent. So what do you think? Should we be getting prebiotics from a supplement or do we get them from food or as a mix? What's the jury?
I am a big food person, try to get your dietary needs met through food rather than supplements. But what I will say is that most of the studies done in prebiotics have been done at levels of about 5 grams or more per day. And that's tough to get out of foods. The other thing you have is we always talk about onions and garlic and maybe bananas have a few prebiotics in them and, maybe a Jerusalem artichoke if you can find that in your grocery store, right? But, it's not that easy to find the food sources and be able to eat enough of them where you're going to get the benefits that have been shown in these studies. And I think that's where the supplemented foods come in. It does at least allow you to tap into a product that reflects the evidence that was developed in a controlled human study.
So you brought up a lot of foods, and being a GI dietitian, the foods that you brought up are fructans primarily, and those are a known prebiotic. But what about galacto-oligosaccharides in beans? Is that controversial or?
No, I don't think it is. And it's interesting you say that because when I think of the top line foods that always get thrown out there about where do you get your prebiotics, it's always the ones that I already mentioned. Beans are certainly a great source of fiber, and fiber is wonderful. I mean, we don't eat enough of it. We know that, the more beans, I can't say the more beans, the better. But I mean, those are all great foods. To the extent that they're what levels of prebiotics, unfortunately, I just don't know. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just curious. I was just curious because they were mostly fructan sources. And when we look at supplements, they're also fructan. So it's inulin, chicory root extract. Those are the ones that you're seeing mostly.
Yeah, you do see galacto-oligosaccharides, but I don't know the commercial names for those either. But the GOS is definitely around as well. But you're probably right. You're more familiar with the products actually than I am on those. But yeah, but GOS is, I think there's a lot of evidence on GOS as well. And yeah.
If you can stand the farting and the
Well,
gas.
that's the thing. Yeah.
Go gentle.
Right,
Go
right,
gentle.
exactly.
I was beans, the magical fruit. The more you eat, the more you toot. We say that a lot at the Real
There you
House.
go.
There's a lot of tooting, and that's okay.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Activia. Backed by over 20 years of research, Activia knows that overall well-being starts from within. The brand was ahead of gut health trends and offers a broad range of products to help address the growing interest in this space. Activia offers a variety of probiotic yogurts and drinks that deliciously support gut health. Enjoying Activia twice a day for 2 weeks as part of a balanced diet and healthy lifestyle may help reduce the frequency of minor digestive discomfort, which includes gas, bloating, rumbling, and abdominal discomfort. Based on a 2024 national survey of registered dietitians and doctors, including primary care, OBGYN, and gastroenterologists, Activia is the #1 recommended probiotic food and beverage brand among registered dietitians and nutritionists, and is the #1 doctor-recommended probiotic brand overall. Activia is a modern gut health innovator and is passionate about helping consumers feel their best. Check out Activia's client resources at activiaguthealthtoolkit.com.
You mentioned 5 grams in the research. Is there a gram amount per day of prebiotics we should be aiming for in adults?
That's what you're looking for, is the 5 grams. If you want to tap into the benefits, I should say 5 grams per day, if you want to tap into the benefits that have been studied. That's pretty much how they've been studied. But we have to keep in mind that the research is just so piecemeal that, no one's done a study on 6.5 grams, or, you know what I'm saying? Like, we don't really know, or probably 4.5 grams. Like, we know that in the studies done, there's 0, there's 5 grams, there's 10 grams, and I'm making this up, but you know what I mean? Like, you have these very distinct amounts that have been tested, and the evidence isn't so broad that we're really clear on exactly what the doses are. And not all prebiotics are the same. And so it depends on if you are doing your study on a fructooligosacchαρide versus a galacto-oligosaccharide versus a polyphenol. And, it's just really hard. So I just know when I've pressed the prebiotic people that know this literature way better than I do, the 5 grams is what they come to, is like they're just, and I think that comes from that there just haven't been studies conducted that have shown benefits below that.
Yeah. And I just want to interject quickly here because there's really interesting emerging evidence in IBD looking at fructans in a subset of patients being inflammatory. So I wonder, just again, to this personal nature of even prebiotics. And we see in IBS patients that fructans are a common trigger to their GI distress. So again, I would just say, work with your healthcare provider listeners, because we've been studying this for a long time, but it's still really kind of in its infancy, and it's not going to be a one size fits all.
No. But I do think what's interesting about a prebiotic, and I don't think we have this robust of evidence with probiotics, in that dietary fiber, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of consensus that that's a good thing. And prebiotics,
Absolutely.
Many of the prebiotics fit into that. And so to the extent you get 1 or 2 grams of a prebiotic along with your other fibers that you're getting through your diet, I just can't help but think that that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
With the fibers, I don't worry quite as much about hitting the exact dose on the nose.
Yeah, I think fiber is important. It's an umbrella term. So there's going to be so many different types of fibers, and it's, listening to your body. But yeah, fiber, we're fiber people here at the Gut Health Podcast. So yay.
Yay, fiber. Yay, fiber. Okay, so last but not least, because we could talk about symbiotics, we could talk about all the things, but we're going to go to postbiotics. What is it? Has this term been sufficiently defined yet, or is it a moving target at this time? Talk to us about where we're at right now.
So postbiotics are a fairly recent concept. The term's been around for over a decade, but it's really kind of coming to a head now because of some new research that's been underway and has been completed on postbiotics. And so you're going to start seeing the term more. And what a postbiotic is a preparation of inanimate microorganisms and or their components that confers a health benefit on the host. Now, to break that down into easier language, I think what we consider a postbiotic is to be a preparation of dead microorganisms. And the microorganisms may either be intact dead microorganisms or they may be cell components. So the microorganism may have been broken apart through some kind of treatment that the preparation underwent. And the preparation may or may not contain microbial metabolites or other microbial end products. And so we're looking at kind of this combination. It's not a purified preparation in the way that you might get purified butyric acid, for example, or something like that. It's really a combination of the microbes or their components, and they may have cell fragments, they may have metabolites and other things thrown in. And I think that when you ask about is the definition established, I think the definition that I just gave you is a fairly clear definition. We have a very clear paper out that talks about it. But I will say there's not consensus on that. So I think that what we're seeing in the marketplace develop, and this is the research I alluded to, some very interesting studies that have looked at heat-killed microorganisms and showing that they have health benefits. And that's a game changer when you start realizing that these microorganisms, once they're dead, are not necessarily inert. Okay. That's an important difference. But where there's lack of consensus is that some people want to say that the metabolites that are produced by the microbes in the absence of the microbes could also be called a postbiotic. And we disagree with that. At ISAP, you mentioned them early on in the podcast, our definition is no, what's key to a postbiotic is to have the microorganism present with or without those metabolites. And so that's where I think we still need to sort it all out in the field.
Yeah, because I was just reading a paper from the Stanford group, and they were really kind of muddying that definition a little bit. Because I've always followed what you've put out, and then their paper was a little bit different, talking about like sourdough itself having postbiotics.
Right. And we can get into that. Do you want to get into that right now?
Well, first, where do we find these postbiotics? I know there's some preparations out there that have been studied for IBS, for instance. So I think it's really interesting in a supplement form. But, just in general, where do we find them? And then just maybe talk through the fermented food piece.
Postbiotics, I think what's important to realize is that just because a microorganism is dead doesn't make it a postbiotic, right? So you have to then go to that last part of the definition about doing a study that shows that it confers a health benefit, okay? So the postbiotics that are on the market, I am not up to date or I'm not aware of exactly what's on the market right now. I don't know who's marketing what in this area and putting a postbiotic term on it. My guess is you can find all kinds of things labeled as postbiotics that would not meet the definition. And unfortunately, you might find all kinds of things labeled as postbiotics that don't have strong science behind them. And we don't have guides in this area yet. I think it's a really emerging field. So any product that you're looking at that says postbiotic, I guess I would dive deeper and find out, well, what studies are they claiming that substantiate a health benefit that would justify my interest in their product? Basically is what I would do. But to get to the fermented foods, I think the important point here is that sourdough bread is a great food. Like we all love sourdough bread.
Yeah.
We all love our fermented products, and I can lead a parade on that topic. I love them. But just because sourdough bread is a great product doesn't mean that it's providing postbiotics. Is it providing you dead microorganisms? Yes. Has anyone done a study showing that the dead microorganisms that are the component of sourdough bread actually lead to a health benefit? So in other words, do you have a controlled study that has a sourdough bread that was made maybe with baking soda or, some sourdough control compared to the actual sourdough? Have you established a health benefit, in any kind of rigorous study? And I don't know the study that's done that. So I would not use the term postbiotic to describe sourdough. I would not say that sourdough is a source of postbiotics.
So even though and I agree with you. I mean, I've read the definitions that have been put out. I just want to clarify this for our listeners. So you have your sourdough and you look at it in a lab. Like I know that they've looked at some of these end products in the bread and there's butyrate in it. Still not a postbiotic, even though we know butyrate could be. The strain isn't characterized or the health benefit hasn't been proven. Just walk the listeners through that a little bit.
First of all, I'm not sure. I don't know how beneficial the amount of butyrate in a bread is going to be for you. And you know this better than I. Isn't butyrate going to be pretty much absorbed in the proximal small intestine? I mean, it's not making its way through your body. It's basically going to be an energy source, right? So butyrate that's produced in situ in the gut is great. It fuels your epithelial cells. I mean, that's great. But that's very different than consuming butyrate, right?
Right.
Okay. So I think that would be a question that I would have about that claim to a benefit. But you're right. If there's solid evidence that some microbial metabolite causes a health benefit on its own and has been studied on its own, and it's present in the bread, then I would say, yes, that sourdough bread, you could reasonably make the case that sourdough bread would deliver that benefit that's associated with whatever it has. Would I call it at that point a postbiotic? Man, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I would have to think about that because, again, the postbiotic is a preparation of these microorganisms, which the sourdough reasonably could be. And if you could, then it's killed in the oven, it's heat killed, and you know that there's a benefit associated with a component, then yeah.
I mean, it's a little edgy there, right?
I think you probably could make the case then. I don't know that you would necessarily have to do the study on sourdough, but we talk about this a lot with all the biotics. Is the method of delivery important? So can you take that Lactocacei bacillus rhamnosus GG, which has been studied in, across a variety of formats, across a variety of clinical endpoints, and just throw it into whatever you want to throw it into and claim that same benefit? And a lot of people do that. That's a lot of the marketplace, but, people question that. And so I think that's what these things might raise. But wow.
Well, our listeners just got a front row seat to what these consensus meetings can look like, where you put, 15 to 20 experts in the room sometimes, asking in these thoughtful ways, these questions on definitions, and you each have your own experience with this. And so it's fascinating for me to listen and kind of have this front seat to the two of you talking about this concept.
Well, I think we have to stay curious, right? And learn from one another. And then that's when things evolve and change, which is, exciting for sure.
Right. No, and it's a great question. It's one that the field has to answer.
Yes. I have one last question that I'm just now thinking more and more. So the concept of a synbiotic is a probiotic and a prebiotic together. Can you just give, hey, I'm a one-stop shop kind of girl, if I can, a quick thought on these and how our listeners may benefit from some of these products?
Yeah, synbiotics, that's a great definition, really. I mean, we would define it more with a lot more words, but essentially you're right, pro and prebiotic. And the complication with synbiotics is I think there are two ways to consider them. One is just a product that delivers two functional ingredients, that you have the pro and the pre together, and they don't necessarily have to interact with each other. Another is that the prebiotic is paired with the probiotic, so that the prebiotic actually, once you consume them, is the food for the probiotic. And so in the absence of the prebiotic in the synbiotic, the probiotic isn't necessarily going to do what it needs to do. Does that make sense? And so that's a much more sophisticated formulation of a synbiotic. And I don't think we have any on the market that actually do that.
Okay.
What we have on the market are combinations, and the idea is to deliver two functional ingredients. I don't know that we would know they don't interact, but we don't have evidence that they do, that they're just kind of functional in their own regard.
Okay.
So you bring up a good point, and this is going back a little bit to a comment a moment ago, but there's so many products that might have known probiotics, and they put 3 of them together, but that product of those 3 have never been tested. That happens all the time. My daughter sent me a probiotic from one of her friends asking me what I thought about it. And I said, well, all three of these have known probiotic, their strain level classifications, but I don't know how they're all working together in that pill. There was nothing on the website, and this is happening all the time. Can you just comment for our listeners, because it drives me a little bit nuts.
And I bet it was expensive.
Very expensive.
Yes. I mean, in an ideal world, if we didn't have limited resources, all of these products would be tested as formulated at the dose, with the combinations that they have. And that's just not the reality. And this is what I would call kind of the ingredient approach to probiotic formulation. So you've got a very strong research base, let's say on the L. rhamnosus GG. You've got a strong research on bifidobacterium, lactis BB12. They do different things. Let's combine them and just give those to our customers. And do you expect the benefits from both of them to be present once the person consumes them? And we've thought about this a lot. And in fact, in the show notes, we can maybe reference one of the papers that we put out addressing this issue. And I guess there's two ways to look at it. One is no, we don't have evidence that they are necessarily delivering the same benefits they would alone. I think that you can go at it from the other way, saying, would we reasonably expect that those benefits would be neutralized by combining them?
Yeah.
Right. And the more we thought about it, what we kind of came to the conclusion of, and again, there's no guarantee on this, but it's like, can you come up with a solid scientific rationale, is that when you consider that these things are taken, you've got a mixed diet, it's going into your stomach with food and all these other things, and then it's ending up in your gut with trillions of other microorganisms. Like, does it really matter that you necessarily have combined these two together?
Yeah.
And, aren't they going to hit the gut or hit the small intestine, wherever it is that they have their effect, and likely be able to do what they would normally do? And that's kind of where we landed on it, which is it would be harder. We think it would be harder you can never prove a negative, but it would be harder to really come up with a solid reason why you would expect them to negatively interact.
Okay.
And not deliver the benefit.
All right.
Is kind of where we ended it up. But it's,
complicated.
Well, it's complicated, and we find ourselves so often in this field lacking the studies that allow us to robustly answer these questions. So we just kind of try to make our best guess.
All right, we're going to do something called a speed round with you today. And we'll go through these as quick as possible. And I think this is the key. We want to use your brain, your knowledge. We know we could probably argue on both sides, but we just want to hear what your answer is.
Okay.
So, we'll move through quick. Prebiotic, probiotic sodas. Are these gut heroes or overhyped?
I'd say overhyped.
Love it. How about kombucha? Gut hero or overhyped?
I mean, it's a good source of live microbes, but I'd say overhyped.
Okay. Morning or night, best time to take a probiotic?
Whatever time that you're more likely to take it.
Good answer.
Data showing that any particular timing is better than another.
Okay. What about probiotics during or after antibiotic use?
I think best to take it with your antibiotic.
Okay.
The studies are typically done that way. And, so just go ahead and take them. The worst that happens is the probiotic doesn't survive as well as it might once you stop. But most of the studies have co-administered them, and then try to use one that's been tested for AAD or for antibiotic-associated diarrhea.
Okay.
Are expensive probiotics better than less expensive probiotics? Yay or nay?
I would say not necessarily, but I will say research is expensive. So a responsible company is going to have to recoup their investment, but that does not mean that irresponsible companies can't sell very expensive products.
I know.
Okay.
It's confusing out there. Are refrigerated probiotics more effective than shelf-stable ones?
I don't think you can say that out of hand. There's been a lot of technological development where they remain stable at room temperature now, and you certainly don't want to get them hot. They will die as the temperature starts to climb, but if you can keep them at room temperature, a lot of them are stable.
All right, and our final question, should we consider these products for long-term or short-term use?
Well, one thing I didn't get a chance to say, I'll bring up now, which is absence of evidence is not evidence of the absence of any benefit. So what I mean by that is I keep saying, and you keep saying, that we need more studies. But just because we don't know that we don't have evidence that things work doesn't mean that they don't work. And so that's why you have to be your best advocate. And so if you find over the course of a year that you're feeling a lot better, you started out taking a probiotic and you're sustaining it and you like it, I would say go for it. I think most of the research on probiotics, though, is focused on more short-term types of indications.
Okay. So we ask all of our guests what they personally do for their own gut health and well-being. So we'd love for you, outside of horseback riding, which sounds wonderful and probably great for your gut, what else do you do?
Well, I don't have anything really clever to say about that. I mean, I try to eat higher fiber foods and I try to eat whole grains and fruits and vegetables. And, it's always a struggle to eat well, but I think that's the smart way to do it. But I mean, overall health, of course, you have to live a life that you can be grateful for and you have to keep your sense of humor, right?
Yes.
And express love to people that you love. And, all of those things I think might be just as important. And I've said already, I'm a big fan of fermented foods. The evidence is not strong right now that it really matters that we deliver unknown microbes in large amounts to our gut. But it sure seems a lot of populations have done this for many years and, not many years, I mean, for millennia. And it seems like it could be a good thing to model, but we don't have the data to be confident in that. So
I think that was a great answer.
Yeah.
like
Lots
that.
of endorphins coming from relationships and food. So that's a
Yeah.
pretty perfect place for us to wrap up today. We thank you so much for your time, Dr. Sanders. We certainly have provided a lovely gut dictionary for our listeners, and we are going to wrap up for the day. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for all of your expertise. And to everyone out there, thank you so much for liking, subscribing, sharing the Gut Health Podcast. We appreciate your support, our friends. Thank you for joining us as we grow this gut health community. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave us a comment. You can also follow us on social media at the Gut Health Podcast, where we'd love for you to share your thoughts, questions, and experiences. Thanks for tuning in, friends. Thank you for joining us as we grow this gut health community. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave us a comment. You can follow us on social media at the Gut Health Podcast, where we'd love for you to share your thoughts, questions, and experiences. Thanks for tuning in, friends.